My name is Elise Gregg, and here is my second discussion for this class. And as a heads up, it will probably be closer to 7 to 9 minutes instead of 5 or 6 minutes. So starting with explain whether you believe alternative sanctions are a viable solution to incarceration for criminal offenders. I believe it depends on the crime and the offender, as well as how sanctions are implemented, though there's many reasons to implement alternative sanctions before or instead of incarceration. You can go with human rights, cost effectiveness, etc. The key factor to consider is whether or not sanctions really do decrease crime and prevent recidivism. 2009 study that was used as testimony before the U.S. Sentencing Commission showed that alternative sentences were A, underutilized, particularly in comparison to incarceration, B, infrequently paired with a prison sentence, with the exception of monetary sanctions, and C, needed for the significant number of offenders who suffer from mental health problems or substance abuse, etc. So the testimony is long and includes some caveats many offenders are ineligible for alternative sanctions because they're non-citizens. Some offenders do return to federal prison because they violate alternative sanctions, so on and so forth. However, there was one line in it that is particularly insightful, which is that we need to develop alternative sanction programs that not only emphasize short-term offender control, but also on long-term offender change. As such, I believe that alternative sanctions are a viable solution for the long-term goal of change that results in an offender reintegrating into society in a way that deters future crime. While pairing alternative sanctions with incarceration in the short term may work to achieve the goal of temporary control, ultimately, they're a viable solution if the goal is preventing crime and reintroducing offenders back into society and not just physically restraining offenders. The testimony even concludes that it's important to redesign existing alternative sanctions based on what works with particular groups of offenders because it will reduce recidivism and the rate of return to prison among federal offenders. And additionally, though some prison sentences can work to reduce or prevent crime, evidence shows that longer sentences don't necessarily result in less crime. In fact, there's an article that I'm going to cite from Law and Policy that discusses this, concluding that alternative sanctions and shorter sentences may have a greater net result in crime reduction than just using longer prison sentences. So in summary on this one, I think that alternative sanctions can work as a solution to incarceration. This is kind of a broad conclusion. Ultimately, I believe that these sanctions work best paired with shorter prison sentences to reduce crime, but these sentences can be just as effective, if not more, at reducing crime, particularly in the long run, with a focus on legitimate change over just simple control. So the next question is, what might be some challenges to their implementation in the international community? When it comes to crime and punishment, differences in cultures, values, legal and political systems, history, etc., it can be difficult to implement alternative sanctions in the international community. I'm also taking international law right now, so I'm getting to learn all about the differences and disagreements. So before even being able to decide on a punishment, there's the challenge of just competing for jurisdiction, getting things into court, etc., etc. However, in the international arena, there are plenty of challenges. It may be difficult for states to agree, even between a few nations, on appropriate punishments for crime. For example, nations like the UK and the US, which overall have many similar systems and characteristics, they're split on the death penalty. And though this is not an alternative sanction, the principle applies because there is disagreement on what's appropriate and what's effective between states. Further, for transnational crime or crimes pertaining to international law, it can often be difficult to implement certain kinds of sanctions on offenders. So, corporations, world leaders, etc., etc. And though there are standards and norms for what punishments are appropriate, when it comes to alternative ones, it can be kind of tricky. Especially on the global stage when, again, there might be disagreement on whether a party's guilty, whether or not they can actually be brought before a court or negotiated with. This is all just before getting into the disagreements on whether alternative sanctions are once again appropriate or effective. Interestingly, the norms of international law do provide some cohesiveness when it comes to sanctions, and sometimes that includes alternative ones. Because, if they're based on these norms, there can be some similarities. So, for example, when it came to the abuses at, and I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Abu Ghraib by the U.S. Army and CIA, an article from the Michigan State Law Review reads, and I quote, "Social sanctions like shaming have a powerful role to play in enforcing international law norms. It took a shaming campaign for expressions of regret and corrective action to ensue. The campaign forced U.S. citizens to come to terms with the fact that their government was acting in violation of internalized international norms, in parentheses, against torture, end quote. The overall challenge in implementing alternative sanctions can be logistics and, once again, agreement on what's the right way to go about something. However, when there is common ground, like with the last case, it can be done, and sometimes it is very effective. Then finally, the last question, with other sanction options, why do the United States and Japan continue to use the death penalty when most industrialized nations have outlawed it? And so this was, largely addressed in the reading. We had this module outside the textbook. And there's a couple reasons that could be attributed to the continued use of the death penalty by a few countries out of the many that no longer use it. I think one of the most baseline things they touched on was moral philosophies. So for example, with the reading, it contrasts a Kantian view that holds that the death penalty is just simply categorically wrong itself, compared to a utilitarian view that holds that capital punishment is, risk-wise not worth it because the damage it may do exceeds the good that it could produce. So from there we can see how the death penalty may be permitted under some circumstances, so in cases where we know that the offender is guilty of serious crimes like rape or murder. From there, using like a utilitarian standpoint, it could be argued that their death outweighs the good of letting an offender live. So closure for victims or families, deterrence, making a stark statement against, certain crimes, etc. Outside philosophy, obviously, there are other reasons why some nations allow capital punishment. Reading, again, discusses public support being one. A particularly compelling argument in democratic societies where those being governed have a serious say in public policy. Regardless of where these opinions are coming from, historical precedents, trends, religious views, etc., even outside of democracies, keeping the people satisfied is a serious consideration for policymakers, including with the death penalty. Just as a brief caveat, this is just the reasons I saw within the reading, not necessarily my personal views on it. A third reason discussed in the article is that the death penalty may provide closure for victims and their families, and although this was not a top consideration in some nations, like the US, Japan was used as an example of a state where people, over time, came to consider capital punishment to be a matter of victims' rights. Another article, titled Capital Punishment, A Global Perspective, examines the progress of worldwide abolition as well as reasons for retaining capital punishment. To some degree, it goes beyond moral or legal issues into discussions on sovereignty. In the article, they quote Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, saying, "In matters of criminal law, the national interest weighs more heavily in the balance than do international norms. And though this may not necessarily be a key reason, maintaining sovereignty and independence may be a reason to resist abolition even when plenty of other countries have removed the death penalty." The article also mentions that belief in the deterring effect of capital punishment as well as cultural and religious norms play into the reasons for keeping the death penalty. So in summary, there's a lot of different reasons. A lot of it has to do with, what's popular, what, has been the norm, so on and so forth. And that's my discussion. All right, about 8 minutes. That's about where I thought I'd land. And my sources are cited below. Thank you all so much.